On that island sits Fort Sumter. On April 12, 1861, a single mortar shell shattered the pre-dawn sky, and the United States, just 85 years old, erupted into all-out civil war.
Initially, for President Abraham Lincoln, the war was about a single overriding goal: saving the Union from the forces of secession in the American South, forces that were threatening to tear the Republic apart.
There was a ditty that people used to sing around Union recruiting that I think sums up what Lincoln's original orientation was. It went something like, "I stand for the Union, all its foes I abhor. I ain't for the N-word, but I am for the war."
Soon after the war began, its focus began to change when enslaved African Americans, forced to work in the Confederacy's defense, escaped behind Union lines.
Escaped slaves who run away to Union lines are called contraband. And what Union policymakers, including Lincoln, begin to recognize is this creates a welcome disruption among the Southern slaveholders. This deprives them of their property, it shuts down their plantations, and it makes their war effort more difficult.
The swelling numbers of contraband pushed President Lincoln to see that the Civil War was actually about abolishing the institution of slavery, ultimately leading him to issue the Emancipation Proclamation.
In many ways, the Emancipation Proclamation is, first and foremost, a military policy. It's not clear the Union is winning the war before the Emancipation Proclamation. So the Emancipation Proclamation also gives these escaped slaves the opportunity to serve in the Union Army. This is crucial to the Union's success in the war effort.
With the freedom of their people at stake, almost 200,000 black men enlisted in the Union Army and Navy, playing a pivotal role in bringing victory to the North.
The key element that changed the outcome of this war in terms of who won it and in terms of what it was about were the slaves themselves. Their determination that this war was going to be about the end of slavery. Masses of self-liberated slaves became the wave that the Union would ultimately ride to victory.
We're the RainbowPUSHCoalition here in Chicago. We'll discuss Emancipation Proclamation, erudite scholar Jesse Jackson Jr. With a book called More Perfect Union. How are you, Jesse? How are you today?
I'm doing great, Reverend. Happy Emancipation Day.
The seriousness of this day is not dealt with by us. We put more focus on King's birthday or something. Emancipation Proclamation was a game changer, wouldn't you say?
There's no doubt about it. It was the most significant executive order ever issued by a president of the United States. And it's not a simple executive order. It's a very complicated executive order. It is political, it is moral, it is strategic, it is deliberative, it is carefully crafted. It creates and welcomes action in both the North and the South. It motivates people in the North, and it despiritualizes some people in the North. It motivates people in the South, and it despiritualizes people in the South. It creates a change tension, and it changed the course of American history.
The South has gotten as far north as Gettysburg and Antietam. Lincoln said 100 days out, if the South does not rejoin Union, he's going to free them, right?
Let's look very specifically at a map. The first slide that I wanted to show you is a map that specifically lays out what the executive order actually accomplishes. Because Washington, D.C. is between Maryland and Virginia, Abraham Lincoln sets the slaves free where he has no control, between Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, and Florida. but he keeps slavery in place where he does have control. In other words, he was able, when he was inaugurated, to convince Missouri, to convince Kentucky, convince Delaware, and convince Maryland, where slavery existed, to stay in the Union. So Lincoln, carefully upon his inauguration, he carefully uses the language, this is about saving the Union. It is about protecting the Union. And the key to that was keeping these maroon states in the Union. For if the day Abraham Lincoln announced that he was against slavery, surely Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware would have joined the Confederacy, and therefore Washington, D.C. would have been completely surrounded, and he would have had to have been president from Paris, France, or somewhere in Canada, because the war would have been lost before it even began.
This was a pivotal decision. It seemed to me that we observed the watch night service, December 31st, just singing prayer all night. But we were watching for the Emancipation Day, right?
We were certainly watching for it, but again, the timing does matter. Abraham Lincoln needs certain critical battles. The war had gone on and on for a couple of years before he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. We needed the momentum that and the moral cause that slavery and ending slavery more specifically brought to the table. In other words, there were Northern African Americans, the United States Colored Troop, the Massachusetts 54th, who were willing to fight, but they weren't allowed in the battle. There were Southern slaves who wanted to self-emancipate and escape from slavery, but they really couldn't because the institution of slavery is a very peculiar institution. And the analogy I like to use, Dad, is there were 15 presidents before Abraham Lincoln. People often ask the question, is Abraham Lincoln responsible for freeing the slaves? There were 15 presidents before Abraham Lincoln, and none of them brought it to this critical point and this critical juncture. You have to give that credit to Abraham Lincoln, but you also have to give credit to the timing of each decision that he made. When I was in prison, Dad, there were many nights where I wanted to self-emancipate. That is, just run out of the prison and just escape. But my self-emancipation is not the same as ending mass incarceration or ending the prison industrial complex. That requires presidential leadership. There were many efforts at ending slavery. Some Blacks traveled the Underground Railroads. Others self-emancipated. Others were helped out of slavery. Others did escape from slavery. But that is not the same as forcing states from Virginia around to Texas to outlaw the institution of slavery and hold them at bay until they do. And so we have to make the distinction between Lincoln's leadership, the 15 presidents who came before Lincoln, who did not bring slavery to that critical juncture in order to advance the idea of emancipation as a human right.
The first 12 of them were slaveholders themselves, right?
Except maybe John Adams. I don't believe John Adams was a slaveholder.
The deal was Lincoln freedom. We saved Lincoln because when Blacks, emancipated Blacks joined the Union Army, we have to beat back the Southerners. So he freed us, we saved him and saved the Union.
Well, this is an argument that is advanced by Lerone Bennett Jr. in his book, Forced into Glory. Dr. Bennett was a very close friend of yours and editor of Ebony magazine. God bless him and God rest his soul. Certainly, again, there were efforts by the United States Colored Troops, but they also needed permission to fight. They also needed to be paid for fighting. They also needed to don on the uniform of the United States of America. They also had to be trained. And so there are a number of federal actions that are necessary even to welcome United States Colored Troops into the North, to encourage African Americans in the South who could hear Lincoln's voice to escape, and then when and if they are captured by the North, to give them the opportunity to join the Union Army and subsequently bring about an end, state by state, to the peculiar institution.
The Emancipation also meant that many Blacks were trying to escape as best they could. Lincoln, it seems to me, by freeing Blacks, he ended the supply line of the Confederacy. We were that supply line. We were in fact backing them up. When we got freed to lead the planet, they had to supply themselves.
He also freed white folks from their shame, from their blame and their guilt. And it also bought us another 157 years of reflecting upon these matters. Just this past week, recognizing the date that this is actually being aired, Robert E. Lee's statue has now been taken out of the Capitol of the United States. that happened at the date, at the hour of the recording. The state of Virginia is now going to replace Robert E. Lee's statue with an African-American woman who was a Virginian who has some extraordinary accomplishments in Virginia. And so the extent to which the ramifications of the war continue in our politics, or as von Clausewitz said, politics is war by other means. They left the battlefield, they entered Congress, they entered state legislatures, they are challenging elections today on the basis of state resistance. And many of the same attitudes that we have seen then are attitudes that we see today, where the president of the United States would even challenge a national election on the basis of he doesn't like what happened in Detroit, and therefore he went after Michigan. He doesn't like what happened in Kenosha, and therefore he went after Wisconsin. He doesn't like what happened in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and therefore he went after the state of Pennsylvania. He's not happy at all with what of the activity in Fulton County, Georgia, in Atlanta and Savannah, and so he went after the entire state of Georgia. This is the exact same activity that we saw at the beginning, during, and at the end of the American Civil War.
My point is just that January the 1st is not just a ham-hock, green, lemonade drinking day. It's the first time, most people have not read the Emancipation Proclamation. It gives us the right to bear arms, the right to say to our slave master, if you try to stop me, I can shoot you. This is a first time a black man was free on American soil. Back in the U.S. government. What do you say?
Not only would I say it, I'd also parallel it to Old Testament theology, where we can only imagine, because we've lived the experience of what it must have been like to leave Egypt land, what it must have been like to cross mentally and even physically out of chattel slavery into a very different space, and then have to recognize at the same time in that new space our new commandments, our new laws, and a new future for our people. But make no mistake about it, without that event, we simply wouldn't be here today.
1857, Supreme Court rules blacks no rights, rights bound respect. War kicks off in 1860. By 63, Lincoln, it seemed to me the South was advancing on the North. And then Lincoln, by freeing us, saved the Union and ended slavery at the same time.
Again, let me show you the second slide. Make no mistake about it. By the slide, the Emancipation Proclamation, once again, it frees blacks from Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas. It frees blacks where Lincoln has no control. And for the Southerners, the Emancipation Proclamation was propaganda. It was like, who cares what Lincoln says? He's not from the Confederacy. But for blacks who heard that Lincoln had freed them, certainly it created a dynamic on the plantation that if you were marching for General Jeb Stuart, or you were marching for Stonewall Jackson, or you were marching as a white Confederate for Robert E. Lee, suddenly you had reason to leave the march and go back to your plantation or go back home because you're concerned about the new activity that is taking place amongst slaves on the plantation. But look at where Abraham Lincoln left slavery in place. He left it in place in Missouri, in Kentucky, in Tennessee, and in Maryland and Delaware. Why? Because if the war at that moment was about slavery, surely those states would have joined the southern states. The Electoral College would have shifted. Washington, D.C. would have been surrounded. And so the careful crafting of the Emancipation Proclamation was very important to Abraham Lincoln being able to hold his coalition together, and at the right time, issuing the Emancipation Proclamation was the key to changing this war from a war about saving the Union to a war about ending slavery. And Abraham Lincoln is responsible for that timing.
It seems to me, if Lincoln had not made that move, our freedom would have been delayed. When I think about it, he said 100 days out to the South, you have 100 days. And so our people, October, November, December, could have been by Santa Claus, they couldn't go out and no Christmas celebration. December 31st, they waited all night long when he signed it the next day. Some historians say he trembled when he signed it. It was such a big deal. Emancipation Proclamation should be read by every black person in America. It's an earth-shattering event. We celebrate Dr. King's birthday, but without the Emancipation Proclamation, it would be a King birthday, as we know it to be today.
What I can tell you is when I was in Congress, I named, along with Zachary Wamp from the state of Tennessee, who happens to be from one of those states that chose to stay in Lincoln's coalition by county. Zach Wamp and I sponsored a piece of legislation that named the largest room in Capitol Hill Emancipation Hall. Newt Gingrich and other conservatives in Congress wanted that room Liberty Hall. But we needed to mark the significance of the event Emancipation. And for the hundreds of thousands of visitors to the Capitol of the United States, when they walk in the door now through the security checkpoints, they enter Emancipation Hall. Emancipation Hall is a unique event. It is not the same as Liberty. Emancipation from slavery is quite a different event. And it should not only be recognized and read by African Americans, Reverend, it should be read, understood, and recognized by all Americans so that the nation does not slip back into the conditions that created the need for the Emancipation Proclamation in the first place.
We've been enslaved for 246 years. What a day. What a season. You redefine Western civilization, Jesse.
There's no doubt about it.
Fast forward to today, you see the ex-slave states rising up. Georgia, case in point. We were driven out of the South. It's interesting, after Lincoln was assassinated.
No doubt about it. If we look at the third slide that I prepared for the presentation today, you will see, Reverend, that in 2016, you see most of the states that are in the blue are essentially the states that were part of Lincoln's coalition, particularly the eastern states, really from the Midwest to the east, because much of the country at the time of Lincoln's presidency had not completely expanded to the western states. In fact, there were battles that were taking place in the western states as to whether or not those states would be admitted as free states or slave states. But if you look at the electoral map in 2016, from Virginia around to Texas, you see nearly the same dynamic as the events of the electoral map of 1860. If you look at the electoral map, save for Georgia in 2020 to the left, you can see essentially presidential elections tend to follow the discourse of the events of 1860 even to this day, with the exception of the fact that Joe Biden won Georgia and New Mexico and Colorado and many of those western states, and this plurality led to his presidency. But you can also see from this map why Trump's rhetoric still means something for nearly half of the country. You can also see from this map why Trump doesn't want to leave gracefully. You can also see from this map that there's a midterm election where the entire Congress of the United States is up for re-election in 2022. And you can see where the battlegrounds are going to be. And that the very people who turned out in 2020 in great numbers for Joe Biden and for Kamala Harris, they tend not to show up in great numbers in midterm elections. And as a result, Trump and members of Congress and even Mitch McConnell and his Senate are trying to keep his voters at a high level of enthusiasm because they want to come back in just 2 short years and try and regain control of the Congress, essentially following this electoral map that you see right here.
Who's Jefferson Davis? What's he fit in this?
Jefferson Davis, when Lincoln was sworn in, Jefferson Davis became the presidency essentially of the red states until such time as Appomattox and the war was over. We had essentially 2 countries. Lincoln never recognized the Confederacy. He called the states in rebellion, but from Virginia around to Texas, for those 4 or 5 brief years, they saw themselves as their own country, and they still behave that way.
They had their own currency on White House in Montgomery and in Richmond. They were trying to cut a deal with France and Britain, importing African to export cotton.
And not just that, Reverend. If you think about the entirety of the civil rights movement, for the most part, while there were elements of it that took place all over the entire country, when you think about John Lewis crossing Edmund Pettus Bridge from Selma to Montgomery, when you think about the Memphis sanitation workers where Martin Luther King Jr. Loses his life, when you think about the students sitting in Greensboro, North Carolina, when you think about Medgar Evers, when you think about Fannie Lou Hamer, when you think about the march of civil rights, most of this activity is taking place in these red states. There is activity in Chicago, there is activity in New York, but the heart of the movement is in the heart of this Confederacy and trying to get nonviolently them to join a coalition of conscience to build better housing, better schools, and healthcare for all.
I want people to see January 1st as different than Hammock Green and ball games. One reads that Emancipation Proclamation carefully. It's fundamental change. First time an American citizen has the protection of the U.S. government, right?
I don't see the difference between January the 1st and the Passover experience that Jewish people celebrate as a religious experience every year. And I don't see the difference between, you say, the ham hocks, the greens, or even the chitlins that we may eat on the beginning of the year. I don't see that any different than the Seder dinner, which is part of the Passover from slavery to freedom. That does require an adjustment in our mental thinking, that just as they came from slavery through plagues and through a process that included putting the blood of lamb on one's door so that the plague would pass by them and pass over them, there should be no doubt that January 1st every year is a Passover experience in our liberation theological traditions.
It changes the entire ball game. In your book, you talk about these days that we should depict: January 1st, 1863, 30 and 40, 50 minutes. Now, when the right-wing Republicans say they are part of the Lincoln Republicans, they're not correct. This is Jefferson Davis Democrats who call themselves Republicans. Will you say?
There's no doubt about that. The red counties are very different than the blue counties. The blue states are barely blue. Only because of the cities are they blue. And that's because of the enormous voter registration turnout and participation of many of those blue counties. But even within the red counties, there is Democratic support. There is support, for example, in Georgia for Warnock, and support for Ossoff in red counties. And so it's not just about winning Atlanta. It's not just about winning Fulton County or even winning Savannah. You still have to have a certain participation level within the red counties, because every vote in that state equals the majority of a vote for a particular candidate. And so the extent to which our messages can reach out across red and blue lines, we can win.
Emancipation Proclamation says on the road to total freedom as a people, and laid the groundwork for us being citizens and not just subjects.
Well, it's really interesting that you would mention that. Certainly, every immigrant since the addition of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment who has entered this country, they define their citizenship by our struggle. I mean, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment came from this event. And this event, which was about the liberation of African Americans in our slave context, today they are the beneficiary of it. These are rights that they inherit that they have never had to earn. And rarely do immigrants come to America seeking to expand rights. They're already leaving tyrannical and despotic positions when they come to the United States. But the process for establishing new rights in America, overcoming the 10th Amendment, states' rights, overcoming the limitations of the Constitution, that burden has fallen upon the Negro, because only the Negro has had to change the Constitution to get his rights. And therefore, the day that Hispanics, the day that Indians, the day that the LGBT community wakes up to the idea that everyone deserves healthcare as a human right, they're going to have to come by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment and the process that we went through to ensure that rights become enshrined in the Constitution of the United States. There's no doubt that the change really after Roosevelt's second or third term, we see this gravitation of former Democrats, Jesse Helms, Strom Thurmond, and others now opposing the so-called big government that is now helping Black people. And they leave the Democratic Party and they start their activity in the Republican Party. Again, following the color line, we get to see the politic of the racial behavior. white men and their wives who once were Democrats and slaveholders moved out of the Democratic Party as African Americans and Hispanics. Others began to register and vote and participate, and they found their interests protected in the Republican Party as opposed to the Democratic Party. And so the Democratic Party is made up today of a coalition of Jesse Jackson and Nancy Pelosi, the coalition of Ossoff, who is Jewish, and Warnock, who is African American. We end up with a unique coalition.
It seems also to me, Jesse, that when this thing took place, that yesterday's Democrats, one of us was a Democrat, all the others were Democrats. They changed parties in '64. And we changed parties. Dr. King's father was a Lincoln Republican. Lincoln Republican was all right to '64, because Lincoln Republicans now became Kennedy Johnson, King Democrats.
But certainly I would argue sometime between Roosevelt's third term and the civil rights movement, there is a shift. Burt Lance, all of his family, many of whom were Confederates, are buried on his property in Calhoun, Georgia. Now he's the director, or was the director, God bless him, of the Office of Management and Budget for Jimmy Carter. And so even though Burt Lance was our close friend and a very good friend of our families, John J. Hooker, many of his family members were Confederates. Big Nashville, Tennessee Democrat. He is now deceased, but he was with John F. Kennedy. But his family, who fought in the Civil War, were all Confederates. And so you have these loyalties where people in the South, even to this day, still have great-great-grandfathers who fought in the war and great-great cousins. And while they may agree with our politics, healthcare for all, housing, a better distribution of wealth, raising the minimum wage, providing people with insurance and assurances during the pandemic, they are also recognized that there is an anxiety amongst people who have been raised in trailer parks, who still raise Confederate flags, who still live in disparate conditions, because many of the promises of our great country have yet to make it to their provinces.
What strikes me also is that the most change agent president since Lincoln was Lyndon Johnson. People remember the South as a betrayer. They don't honor him at Democratic conventions, for example.
You know, I think I once heard you give a speech to the Johnson Foundation, and you referred to Lyndon Johnson as probably the greatest president in the 20th century. And I actually share that insight with you. Clearly, the landmark legislation of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the public accommodations legislation between 1967 and 68 is simply not possible without the leadership of Lyndon Baines Johnson. He is definitely an unsung hero. And I think personally, no president has had to move their minds from where they were and how they were reared to where Johnson ended up more than Lyndon Johnson. What we see in Johnson is like a Saul to Paul conversion. We see a person who was on the one hand a tax collector, and then we see a person on the other hand who wants to spread the gospel of Jesus of Nazareth to the end of the world. And so the evidence in Lyndon Johnson's life is that someone who had fought against us hand, tooth, and nail could ultimately emerge as someone who advanced the cause of civil rights and human liberty, unlike any other president since Abraham Lincoln. And I want to add this, Reverend. The 1964 Civil Rights Act didn't just guarantee civil rights for African Americans, it guaranteed the American Disabilities Act. It guaranteed civil rights for the LGBTQ community. It guaranteed civil rights for short white men who could not get a job as a state trooper in Alabama, because the state's requirement was that you had to be 6 feet tall in order to be a state trooper. Even short white men who did not like Martin Luther King Jr. could go to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and tell the state of Alabama, you cannot discriminate against me because I am a short white man.
Here's enough in 60, because blacks had the right to vote in 65. White women couldn't vote, couldn't serve on juries in the South. 18-year-olds couldn't vote in the South. They couldn't vote at all. They served in Vietnam. Native Americans got the right to vote in 73. on college campus and bilingual by 75. So in some sense, a new majority came out of August 6, 65. A new majority was born.
And that is precisely my point about the Emancipation Proclamation. Not only should every African American read it and understand it, but every American should, because it seems like it just frees Black people. But the fact of the matter is, Abraham Lincoln freed everybody.
In some sense, but I would make the case that it was closed. He freed us, we saved him. If we had not joined the Union Army, the South would defeat them. We were fighting our own freedom and saving the Union. And so we have a stake in the game. I want to express my thanks to you, Jesse. You're such a profound teacher. You teach so well. You know this stuff so good. We'll talk more about this in weeks to come. I think we should sit right on Emancipation Proclamation for a season. Our people need to know what's happening. What about the Dred Scott case of 1857? What does that mean? Blacks no right, whites bound respect. What about 1896, the apartheid decision, the 54 decision? All this lays the groundwork for where we are today. And I want to thank you for saying that on January the 1st, it's not about ball games and Martin Green. It's the single biggest day. If I reread the Emancipation Proclamation, I can help to see where we're empowered by the federal government to bear arms, to man vessels. In fact, to bear arms against our slave masters if they try to maintain us on the plantation. Big stuff in that Emancipation Proclamation, Jesse.
And only one president was willing to do it, and that was Abraham Lincoln. Thank you, Dad.
Thank you, Jesse. God bless you, my son.
God bless you.